you find learning new music a challenge? Are you looking for a better and quicker way to make consistent progress? If so, you're in the right place. In this video, I'm going to take you through 3 tips that will save you time, get you better results, and leave you feeling more motivated and confident. But before we dive in, I'm Fiona from Learn Music Together, and I help adults grow and develop their practice skills so that they can play with confidence. And I'd love it right now if you could hit the big subscribe button below. So many learners try and play the entire piece every time they practice. And if that's you, I want you to keep listening to this video because it's really not an effective way to make progress, nor is it the best way to use your practice time. So before I dive into tip number 1, let's look at 3 scenarios that you definitely don't want to do when you practice a piece of music. Number 1, you start at the beginning, you play through until you make a mistake, you do a bit of practice to correct that error, and then you carry on until you make your next error, and you repeat the whole process and you try and get from the beginning of the piece to the end. And you do that every time you practice in the hope that things will gradually improve. Number 2, maybe you play from the beginning until you make your first mistake. Again, you do a bit of work to overcome that mistake, then you go back to the beginning and try it again. If that's you, again, keep listening. Number 3, maybe you just try and muddle your way through the entire piece every time you practice, and your sole aim is to get the notes right and in the right place. And of course, along the way, you make lots of mistakes, you do some practice, and you just repeat that process every single day, again in the hope that you will gradually get to a place where you can play all the notes in the right place. Now, each one of those scenarios I just described is not what you want to be doing in your practice. You want to practice in bite-sized sections, and you want to plan these sections ahead of time. I'm a big advocate of using a practice diary, and it really does pay you dividends to plan your practice sessions in advance. Your aim is to take a small section of music each practice session, have a focus, and obviously make improvements. Now, to accomplish that in the quickest way, you don't want to do any of those scenarios that I previously described. You want to layer up the process. So what do I mean by that? Well, don't just put the music there, choose your bite-sized section and have a go. That's not the best way to achieve accuracy. We need to think about each component that section needs in order to be able to play it. So for example, there's rhythm, there's notes, there's fingering, there's coordination, there's perhaps dynamics, articulation, all these separate little things that need to be right in order for us to be able to play that phrase accurately. So we want to build up each of these in what I call layers. I always like to start with the rhythm. So the first thing is to perhaps write on the counts that you're going to say. Now, this is not the counts in terms of the beats, this is what you're going to vocalize in terms of the rhythm. So you could say 1 for a crotchet or a quarter note. You could say 1 and if you've got 2 quavers or 2 eighth notes. I personally like to use words, so I use T when I've got crotchets, I use rest when I've got a rest, I use coffee when I've got 2 quavers. The way you do it is entirely up to you, but you definitely want to have a method of being able to vocalize the rhythm. So the first thing I do is I practice vocalizing the rhythm using a metronome, and it's essential that you always use a metronome because that means we're playing with precision right from the get-go. I've got a separate video on playing with metronomes, and I can hear some of you saying it puts me off and all those things. I'm not going to get into that here, but I strongly recommend that you always use a metronome. The second thing you want to do is clap out that rhythm to a metronome. And while you're doing this, I recommend vocalizing that rhythm still. We're not ready yet to internalize it. Third, once you can do the clapping, see if you can play that rhythm on 1 note. And again, think of vocalizing the counts if that's possible. If you play a wind instrument or a brass instrument, I appreciate that you can't play and speak at the same time. So you need to work on internalizing that vocalization of the counts, making sure that we do say something inside here to make sure that we align the rhythm with the beats. So again, keep that metronome on. Then I like to kinesthetically practice the notes. So maybe I read through the letter names if I need to. Maybe I go through the fingering very gradually. I don't actually play the notes at this stage, I just mime them. And only then do I start to think about playing the right notes to the rhythm. And I like to use a method called build outwards. I don't recommend trying to just play the whole phrase, even if you've done the clapping and kinesthetic practice. We want to make sure that we're playing the notes correctly and the rhythm correctly and the right articulation, etc. every time we play. It's really important if we want to eliminate errors. I've got a separate video on how to build up your bite-sized section with the right notes, so I'll link to that below this video. But for now, know that when you practice, you want to layer up the process and you want to practice in bite-sized sections. That was my first practice tip. Now in your next practice session, you'll do exactly the same thing, but this time with a different bite-sized section from your piece of music. And you want to avoid the temptation to start each practice session by recapping what you did yesterday or on your last session. It's what so many learners do because they're afraid that they're going to forget what they've already learned. But one thing I can tell you is endless repetition often does more harm than good. So for many reasons, but here's a couple. The more times you repeat something, the more times you practice it, the more likely you are to make mistakes. And we want to avoid mistakes. So spacing out your learning allows you to maintain a higher degree of accuracy, along with many other benefits, such as being able to retain the information for longer. Yes, you heard me correctly. If we don't repeat things quite so much in one session, we are actually helping ourselves remember that information for longer, not forget it. Another important factor is endless repetition can be boring. And when we start to feel bored, we slip into unconscious awareness. This is something we do regularly throughout our day. A great example would be when we drive a car almost on autopilot. You know, if you go into the same place every day, you get in your car, you don't really think about things, you don't observe your surroundings, you kind of just get in the car, drive, and you arrive where you're going. But if you're driving to a new place, somewhere you've never been before, in a new location, you're much more focused and aware. You observe signs on the road. You're looking out for things. You talk to yourself perhaps about, I need to turn right at the next junction. You're giving yourself specific instructions. And we've just got a greater sense of alertness. Now when we practice music, we want to stay engaged. We want that heightened sense of alertness. We want to be fully aware and fully present. We need to be actively listening, and we definitely don't want to be feeling bored. We want to challenge the brain, and that's what all these things do, which is why it's harder to practice really effectively, because it's so easy to go into that unconscious awareness. And when we do that, we're almost telling the brain that this is unimportant. It's not worth remembering. So making sure you're fully aware of everything that you're doing with that heightened sense of alertness is essential if we want to help the brain form long-term memories. In a way, you're telling the brain that this is important. And yes, you're working harder right now, but in the long term, when we work harder with the encoding of information, in other words, the practicing of the notes, it makes retrieval so much easier later on. Now, studies have shown that humans forget about 50% of the information they learn within 1 hour. So yes, many of the things that pass through our brain in the day go in and out within 1 hour, and we don't retain that information. That is, unless you change the way you encode the information. One of the essential things, if we're going to remember things for longer, is that the brain needs to be able to connect it to former memories. And one of the best ways to help the brain connect something to a former memory is by identifying patterns in your music. And this is why I recommend annotating your score before you ever begin practicing a piece. By taking the time to look for patterns in your music and write on perhaps the key changes and any scales that you can identify or any chords, we're really strengthening the encoding process. And this will help the brain, when we come to play in our practice sessions, connect it to a former memory. Now I've got a separate video again on exactly what we should look for and what we should annotate in our score. So be sure to check that one out, because it's one of the tips that's highly effective in making learning a piece of music easier. So that's tip number 1, bite-sized sections, layer things up and make sure we annotate the music before we begin so that we can help the brain form longer-term memories. Tip number 2 is to describe what you're practicing in between your repetitions. Now I see it so many times in the practice room, adults they try something, then they just repeat it and they repeat it, and they almost don't draw breath. You just go on like this continuous loop of trying to play something. And that's not effective. We need to spend time helping our brain encode the information and giving it specific instruction. So once you've played something once, stop and then see if you can describe exactly what you've just played. Now ideally you want to do this without looking at the music, because this forces the brain to practice retrieving information. Learners are very good at inputting the information, that's what we call encoding, but rarely do they practice retrieval. And retrieval is essential because that's what we rely upon to play that piece of music or that passage of music accurately now and in the future. It helps us form a better long-term memory. So we have to practice retrieval because it activates a separate part of the brain. And this is why many of you can play something in the practice room, but when you go outside of your practice space, maybe for a lesson, you make more mistakes. And that's because in your lesson, you're retrieving information and you've not practiced that. You've only practiced inputting the information. Encoding and retrieval relies upon different parts of the brain. In the hippocampus, we've got two areas, and it's the anterior region that's activated during encoding. You can see that on the screen here in blue, and the posterior region that is activated when we retrieve information, and you can see that here in red. So we do need to practice both these skills, encoding and retrieval. When we decide that we need to recall something, the brain gets to work gathering all the information, and if we want it to do its job effectively, we need to give it specific instructions. And if you're vague in the instructions, it's confusing for the brain and it uses a lot of energy, and that's why sometimes we make mistakes. The brain hasn't got all the right information. So with my tip number 2, by describing what you're doing before you do another repeat, you're really helping the brain pull out the right files and you're giving it specific instructions, and this helps your accuracy, your long-term memory, your retrieval skills. So it's very beneficial and something that will help you make quicker progress. So the best way to do this is to ask yourself questions. You've just played a phrase. Now, without looking at the music, see if you can ask yourself questions. For example, what were the notes? Can you name any of the notes? And don't worry at first if you can't remember that many. Maybe you can only remember the starting note or the last note you played. Can you clap out the rhythm? Can you remember how that rhythm goes? Can you perhaps describe any of the positions or any of the fingering patterns? Can you describe the dynamics or the articulation? Write yourself a list of questions and then ask them every time you repeat. And don't worry, like I say, if you can't remember much, that's okay. Ask the question, see what you can remember, then take a look at your music, and then ask the question again and see if you can remember a little bit more. The more you do this, the better you get. So don't be put off if at first you find that you're asking questions and you can't answer them. You'll be much better at it the second time around because you've heightened your awareness. You're expecting now to ask the questions, so we pay more attention. So again, in doing this, you're raising your level of focus and awareness, and the higher we can do that, the better results we're going to get in our practice, and we're also helping the brain form longer term memories. So it's so important that we connect the cognitive side of the brain with the bit that we rely on to play the actual notes. Repetition alone will not get us to the finishing line. So making sure that we understand and really form patterns that we can connect to is a great way of making better and quicker progress. My third and final tip is to reflect on how your practice has gone. In tip number 2, I mentioned the importance of retrieval, and while there are many ways that you can practice retrieving information, one of the best ways is through reflection. Reflection empowers memory. It's the super force of learning, so always make sure you write down in your practice diary how things went at the end of your session. By reflecting on what you've done, you're telling the brain that this information is really important. It needs proper storage. We don't want it to become one of those bits of information that we forget within the hour. So by writing it down and reflecting on our session, we're telling the brain that this is important information. I want to keep hold of it. So you can describe how you feel. How did your practice go today? What did you do? What went well? What didn't go so well? What are you going to do tomorrow to improve things? Anything you like, but just describe the whole process. Put a timer on if you're somebody who procrastinates for maybe 5 or 10 minutes, and just jot everything down in your practice diary. So those are my 3 tips for helping you make quicker and better progress when you practice. Just to recap, tip number 1, always practice in bite-sized sections. Focus on layering up the elements when you practice. So do the rhythm first, then kinesthetically practice the notes, then build the phrase outwards. And don't forget, I've got a video you can watch on that. Tip number 2 was to stop in between repetitions and describe what you've just played, ideally from memory. Ask yourself questions such as, what was the starting note? What were the finger numbers? Can I clap out the rhythm? And remember, don't be too disheartened if you can't remember much. Every time you do this exercise, you'll get better and better at it. And tip number 3 was to reflect on how your practice has gone. This is so essential, as it tells the brain that what you've just done is important and it's something that you want to remember in the long term. Alrighty, before I go, if you want more practice tips, I've got a free guide for you. You can click the link that you see on the screen right now. I've put links to those other videos below this in the description. And in my next video, I'd love to show you exactly what to annotate in your score to help you get off to the best start when you learn a piece of music, and also help your brain establish those patterns that it can connect to when you actually start physically practicing the music. See you in the next video.